In the heart of the Soviet Union, nestled within the expansive landscapes of Ukraine, stood the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a testament to the era's technological ambition and engineering prowess. Conceived and constructed under the watchful eye of the Soviet government, Chernobyl was more than just a power plant. It was a symbol of the nation's rapid industrial advancement and its unwavering faith in the promise of nuclear energy. The plant's massive concrete and steel structures dominated the skyline, its reactors humming with the invisible, potent force of atom-splitting power. To the world, and indeed to many of its own citizens, Chernobyl represented the Soviet Union's ability to harness the complex and dangerous forces of nature for the betterment of humanity. It was a marvel of modern engineering, equipped with the latest technology, and heralded as the pinnacle of safety and efficiency. Yet, beneath the surface of this monumental achievement, there were whispers of concern. Among the engineers and scientists who roamed its vast corridors, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that all was not as perfect as official reports claimed. Safety protocols, though stringent on paper, were often bypassed in the pursuit of productivity targets and economic efficiency. Reports of minor incidents and malfunctions trickled through the grapevine, only to be quietly dismissed or buried under layers of bureaucracy, their implications downplayed by those in charge. Warnings from a few cautious voices were lost in the cacophony of the plant's daily operations, overshadowed by the pressing demands of energy production and national pride. The Soviet machine, unwavering in its pursuit of progress, appeared indifferent to the simmering risks beneath its feet. Chernobyl, for all its glory as a marvel of Soviet engineering, stood on a precipice, its underlying issues ignored, its potential dangers whispered about yet unacknowledged by the powers that be. In this atmosphere of silent tension and ignored warnings, the stage was set for a disaster of unprecedented scale, one that would forever alter the course of history. Alexei Ivanov stood at the threshold of his new life, his gaze fixed on the towering silhouette of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. A young engineer, fresh from the university, he carried with him not just the aspirations of his humble beginnings, but a deep-seated belief in the transformative power of nuclear energy. Alexei had always been captivated by the promise of nuclear power. A clean, efficient, and seemingly limitless source of energy that could propel humanity into a new era of prosperity and innovation. His decision to work at Chernobyl was driven by more than just ambition, it was a calling. Despite the whispers of risks and the veiled warnings from his professors, Alexei saw himself as part of a noble pursuit. To him, Chernobyl was not merely a job site, but the epicenter of a revolution in energy, a place where he could contribute to the betterment of society and help the Soviet Union achieve its grand vision of the future. From his first day on the job, Alexei's idealism set him apart from his more seasoned colleagues. He approached his work with a zeal that bordered on reverence, eager to learn everything he could about the plant's operations and technology. His enthusiasm was infectious, and even the most cynical of his peers couldn't help but admire his dedication. But Alexei's idealism was not blind. He understood the dangers inherent in the work they were doing, the fine line they walked every day between harnessing and being overwhelmed by the atom's power. Yet, he believed in the systems in place to protect them, in the importance of their work, and in the possibility of progress without catastrophe. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Alexei's passion for his work only deepened. But so too did his awareness of the subtle, unsettling discrepancies between the official reports and the reality of the plant's operations. It was a growing realization that would soon thrust him into the heart of a struggle not just for the truth, but for the very safety of the world around him. As Alexei Ivanov settled into the rhythm of his work at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, his initial awe at the facility's grandeur began to be tempered by unsettling observations. With each passing day, his keen eye and sharp mind started to notice anomalies that couldn't be easily dismissed. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible to those not looking for them, but to Alexei, they were like ripples on the surface of water, hinting at something lurking beneath. It began with the safety reports, documents that were supposed to be meticulous records of the plant's operational integrity. Alexei, with his unwavering belief in the importance of nuclear safety, studied these reports with diligence. However, he couldn't help but notice discrepancies between the reported data and his own observations. Numbers didn't always add up, and incidents that he knew had occurred were conspicuously absent or downplayed. It was as though the reality of the plant's operations was being carefully curated, leaving a sanitized version for official consumption. The more he noticed, the more he listened, and it wasn't long before Alexei began to overhear conversations that added layers of concern to his growing suspicions. Snippets of dialogue caught in passing, hushed discussions between senior engineers and management in the shadowy corners of the facility, spoke of ongoing issues that were never publicly acknowledged. There were mentions of equipment malfunctions that were more frequent and severe than the report suggested, and of safety protocols being bypassed to maintain productivity targets. These overheard conversations were a revelation to Alexei, painting a picture of a plant where operational safety might be compromised, not out of malice, but under the immense pressure to meet the demands placed upon it. The realization was a heavy burden for someone who had come to Chernobyl filled with hope and belief in the potential of nuclear energy. Yet, it also ignited a spark within him, a determination to understand the full extent of the situation and, if possible, to do something about it. Alexei's trust in the system began to waver, replaced by a growing conviction that he could not remain passive. The discrepancies in the safety reports and the whispered concerns he had inadvertently become privy to compelled him to look deeper, to question the narratives being presented to him. It was a decision that would soon lead him down a path of discovery and confrontation, challenging not only his ideals, but also his courage and his commitment to the truth. As the weeks turned into months, Alexei Ivanov and a small cadre of like-minded colleagues at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant delved deeper into the inconsistencies and oversights they had uncovered. Their initial concerns, sparked by discrepancies in safety reports and overheard snippets of conversation, had evolved into a concerted effort to piece together the true state of the plant's operational safety. What they found was increasingly alarming: a complex mosaic of ignored protocols, suppressed incidents, and systemic vulnerabilities that painted a grim picture of potential disaster. Through clandestine meetings and shared observations, the group compiled evidence that suggested the plant was not just flirting with danger, it was on a collision course with catastrophe. The safety measures, lauded in official documents as infallible, appeared to be riddled with gaps and weaknesses, often compromised for the sake of maintaining output levels. Critical systems and components showed signs of strain, yet repairs and maintenance were frequently postponed or rushed, leaving them susceptible to failure. The most chilling realization came when they analyzed the potential consequences of these compounded risks. A failure in one part of the system could trigger a domino effect, leading to a scenario that was unthinkable yet increasingly plausible: a catastrophic event that could unleash untold devastation on the surrounding area and beyond. The evidence was not just theoretical, it was grounded in the reality of the plant's day-to-day operations, supported by hard data and first-hand observations. This realization was a turning point for Alexei and his group. The risk of a catastrophic event at Chernobyl was no longer a distant possibility, it was an imminent threat, one that demanded immediate action. The plant's safety, the well-being of its workers, and the lives of the thousands living in the vicinity hung in the balance. Faced with the magnitude of what they had uncovered, Alexei and his colleagues understood that the situation was far beyond anything they could ignore or leave to chance. The need for changes was not just urgent, it was critical. The path forward was fraught with challenges, not least of which was the likelihood of resistance from the plant's management and the broader bureaucratic apparatus. Yet, the alternative, a disaster of unprecedented scale, was unthinkable. Armed with their findings and driven by a sense of duty to prevent a catastrophe, they prepared to take their warnings to those in power, hoping that the evidence they had gathered would be enough to spur action before it was too late. Understanding the gravity of their discovery and the potential consequences of inaction, Alexei Ivanov and his small group of concerned colleagues at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant recognized that mere words and informal reports would not suffice to prompt the necessary changes. The bureaucratic machinery of the Soviet system, coupled with the inherent reluctance of the plant's management to admit to flaws or oversights, meant that their warnings needed to be irrefutable. They decided that gathering incontrovertible evidence was their best and perhaps only course of action to avert the looming catastrophe. This decision marked the beginning of a meticulous and risky endeavor. The group set out to compile a comprehensive dossier of evidence that would clearly demonstrate the plant's vulnerabilities and the potential for disaster. This included detailed logs of equipment malfunctions. Their efforts were conducted with the utmost secrecy, aware that any hint of their investigation could lead to severe repercussions from the authorities. The atmosphere within the plant became one of silent tension, as Alexei and his colleagues balanced their daily responsibilities with the clandestine collection of evidence. Nights were spent analyzing data and corroborating testimonies, piecing together a compelling case that they hoped would be impossible for the plant's management and the Soviet authorities to ignore. The group knew that the evidence they were gathering carried significant weight, not just in terms of the immediate risks it exposed, but also in highlighting systemic flaws within the Soviet approach to nuclear safety. They aimed to present their findings in a manner that was both undeniable and constructive, offering a roadmap for rectifying the identified issues before a tragedy could occur. As they prepared their report, Alexei and his colleagues were driven by a complex mix of fear, determination, and hope. Fear of the consequences if they failed to act, determination to see their mission through, and hope that their efforts would lead to meaningful change. It was a precarious path they had chosen, fraught with personal and professional risks, but the alternative, a disaster that could claim countless lives and devastate the environment, was unimaginable. Their resolve was clear. They would present their incontrovertible evidence to the plant's management and the Soviet authorities, come what may. As Alexei Ivanov and his group of conscientious colleagues at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant pressed forward with their mission to compile and present incontrovertible evidence of the plant's dire safety risks, they soon encountered obstacles that went beyond the bureaucratic inertia they had anticipated. Their quest for truth and safety, noble as it was, did not go unnoticed by certain elements within the plant's hierarchy and, perhaps, beyond. The gathering of sensitive information, especially in a highly controlled environment like the Soviet Union, attracted unwelcome attention that manifested in increasingly sinister ways. Surveillance became the first sign that their efforts were not just being monitored but actively opposed. Members of the group noticed unfamiliar faces shadowing them as they moved about the plant, and even during their cautious meetings outside of work. These silent watchers never directly confronted Alexei and his colleagues, but their presence was a clear message. Their activities were being observed, and their movements tracked. Intimidation followed, with the pressure ratcheting up in an attempt to dissuade them from their path. Anonymous threats began to appear, sometimes as notes left in personal lockers, or in the form of veiled warnings during seemingly casual conversations with strangers. The message was always the same. Cease your investigations, or face consequences. These threats extended beyond the confines of the plant, reaching into the personal lives of Alexei and his allies, adding a deeply personal dimension to the risks they faced. Sabotage was the most alarming development. Vital documents and data that Alexei and his group had meticulously gathered started to disappear, erased from computers or stolen from their secure hiding places. Efforts to document safety violations were systematically undermined, with evidence being destroyed or altered beyond recognition. These acts of sabotage were not just attacks on their mission, but also on the very safety of the plant, as they erased hard-earned insights into the precarious state of its operations. Faced with surveillance, intimidation, and sabotage, the resolve of Alexei and his group was severely tested. Each new obstacle underscored the lengths to which their unknown adversaries were willing to go to keep the status quo unchallenged. The realization that they were up against a powerful and potentially dangerous opposition forced them to adopt even more cautious measures in their efforts. Despite the mounting risks, the group's commitment to preventing a catastrophic event at the plant only deepened. The adversities they faced served not to deter them, but to reinforce the critical importance of their work. They understood that backing down would not only spell failure for their mission, but could also lead to dire consequences for countless innocent lives. As the clandestine efforts of Alexei Ivanov and his group to compile a comprehensive report detailing the Chernobyl nuclear power plant safety failures neared completion, the atmosphere within the plant and among the group was fraught with a palpable tension. Despite the surveillance, intimidation, and sabotage they had faced, they persevered, driven by a sense of urgent responsibility to avert a disaster they knew was looming on the horizon. Their report, a damning testament to the negligence and systemic failures endangering the plant, was nearly ready to be presented to the plant's management and the Soviet authorities. It was a moment of precarious hope, a chance to enact change before it was too late. However, just as they were finalizing their findings, an unexpected announcement was made. The plant was to conduct an unscheduled test on one of its reactors. The test, ostensibly aimed at evaluating the reactor's safety systems under power failure conditions, was planned hastily and communicated to the staff with minimal advance notice. To Alexei and his colleagues, this sudden decision to conduct a high-stakes test under the plant's current compromised safety conditions seemed recklessly dangerous. The timing could not have been worse. The group knew that the plant's operational and safety protocols were not in a state to safely conduct such a test, especially with the myriad issues they had documented. The decision to proceed, apparently without adequate preparation or consideration of the plant's vulnerabilities, was a stark reminder of the very issues their report sought to address. It underscored the systemic disregard for safety that had permeated the plant's operations, and now, it threatened to precipitate the very catastrophe they were desperate to prevent. The announcement of the test put everything at risk. Not only were the lives of the plant's workers and the surrounding communities in immediate danger, but the opportunity for the group to present their findings and possibly enact change was also jeopardized. If the test led to an incident, the consequences could be catastrophic, rendering their efforts to improve the plant safety moot. As the day of the test approached, the group scrambled to finalize and submit their report, hoping against hope that it would be enough to halt or at least delay the test until the plant safety could be assured. The tension among the group and within the plant reached a fever pitch, with the impending test casting a long shadow over their efforts. It was a race against time, with the group pushing to expose the plant's dangerous flaws before the test could potentially trigger a disaster beyond their worst fears. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, with the stakes impossibly high not just for Alexei and his colleagues, but for the entire region surrounding Chernobyl. In the critical hours leading up to the unscheduled test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Alexei Ivanov, driven by a mix of desperation and determination, made a bold attempt to intervene. Armed with a comprehensive report that he and his colleagues had painstakingly compiled, detailing the myriad safety failures and risks associated with the plant, Alexei sought to reach the decision-makers in time to halt or postpone the test. He understood the gravity of the moment. The test could potentially trigger the very catastrophe they had feared and worked so hard to prevent. Despite the surveillance and intimidation efforts that had dogged their steps, Alexei managed to secure a meeting with senior plant management under the guise of discussing routine operational matters. Once in the meeting, he unveiled the report, laying bare the evidence of negligence and the dire consequences that could follow if the test proceeded as planned. He implored the management to reconsider, to prioritize the safety of the workers, the surrounding communities, and the environment over the perceived necessity of conducting the test under such precarious conditions. However, his efforts were met with resistance and disbelief. The plant's management, entrenched in a culture of secrecy and denial, dismissed Alexei's warnings as exaggerated and unfounded. Accusations were made against him, suggesting that his actions were driven by alarmism or even ulterior motives. The bureaucratic inertia and the systemic suppression of dissenting voices within the Soviet system stifled his pleas for caution. The test, they insisted, would proceed as scheduled, with assurances that all safety protocols would be observed. Heartbroken and frustrated, Alexei watched as the plant moved forward with the test, despite the clear dangers it posed. His attempt to intervene, to leverage the evidence he and his colleagues had gathered in hopes of averting a disaster, had failed. The test began, and within a short period, the worst fears encapsulated in their report materialized. A catastrophic sequence of events was triggered, leading to an explosion and subsequent reactor meltdown. The disaster that unfolded was unprecedented, releasing massive quantities of radioactive materials into the environment. The immediate and long-term consequences of the accident were devastating, affecting countless lives and leaving a lasting scar on the region. Alexei's worst fears had come true, not for want of trying to prevent them, but because the system in place refused to heed the warnings that could have averted the catastrophe. The disaster at Chernobyl became a grim testament to the dangers of ignoring the warnings of those who dare to speak out against negligence and complacency in the face of potential calamity. In the aftermath of the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, chaos reigned. The night sky was illuminated by the hellish glow of the fire, with smoke billowing into the air, carrying with it deadly radioactive particles. The initial moments following the explosion were marked by confusion and disbelief as the magnitude of the disaster began to unfold. Emergency response teams scrambled to the site, faced with a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, while the plant's workers and the residents of nearby Pripyat were plunged into a nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Alexei Ivanov, who had so desperately tried to prevent this disaster, survived the initial explosion. However, the relief of survival was quickly overshadowed by a profound sense of devastation. As he navigated the chaos, the extent of the disaster became heartbreakingly clear. The loss of friends and colleagues in the explosion and the ensuing efforts to contain the disaster weighed heavily on Alexei. These were individuals he had worked alongside, shared meals with, and confided in about his fears and hopes for the plant safety. Their absence was a palpable void, a reminder of the human cost of the disaster that statistics and reports could never fully convey. The realization of the disaster's magnitude was overwhelming. The explosion had not only destroyed the reactor, but it also unleashed a radioactive cloud that would drift across borders, contaminating land, water, and air, affecting countless lives for generations to come. The immediate aftermath saw heroic efforts by emergency responders and plant workers to contain the disaster, often at great personal risk from radiation exposure. Alexei, grappling with survivor's guilt and the burden of his unheeded warnings, committed himself to aiding in the response efforts. He was driven by a need to do something, anything, to mitigate the impact of the disaster, even as he mourned the loss of his friends and faced the harsh reality of the devastation he had feared. The events at Chernobyl changed Alexei irrevocably, transforming him from an idealistic engineer into a somber witness to the consequences of ignoring the perils of nuclear energy when safety is compromised. The disaster at Chernobyl, with its widespread environmental, health and social implications, became a somber reminder of the fragility of human endeavors and the imperative of vigilance and transparency in the face of potential dangers. For Alexei, the explosion was not just a moment of physical destruction, but a profound personal and professional reckoning, marking the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another, defined by the quest for accountability and the pursuit of a safer future. In the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the response was characterized by a chaotic mix of confusion, denial, and misinformation from officials. As the scale of the catastrophe began to emerge, the Soviet government's instinctive response was to control the narrative and minimize the perceived extent of the disaster. This approach led to critical delays in evacuating the nearby town of Pripyat and in informing the public and the international community about the severity of the situation. The first hours and days following the explosion were marked by a palpable sense of uncertainty among the plant's management and local authorities. There was a reluctance to acknowledge the full extent of the disaster, partly due to the lack of immediate information on the magnitude of the reactor damage and radiation levels, and partly due to a systemic aversion to admitting failures that could reflect poorly on the Soviet nuclear program. Emergency services and plant workers were dispatched to tackle the raging fire and stabilize the situation, often without adequate protection against radiation or a full understanding of the risk they were being exposed to. Misinformation and incomplete briefings led to underestimation of the danger, placing countless lives at further risk. Meanwhile, officials hesitated to issue evacuation orders for Pripyat, leaving the residents exposed to dangerously high levels of radiation. The delay in evacuating the city, which was home to thousands of people, was a stark example of the initial denial and confusion that compounded the disaster's human toll. The government's priority seemed to be the protection of the state's image rather than the immediate welfare of its citizens. As the news of the explosion slowly began to leak to the wider world, the Soviet government's initial statements downplayed the incident, insisting that the situation was under control and the radiation levels were not harmful. This narrative was maintained even as evidence to the contrary became undeniable, with radiation detectors in neighboring countries picking up elevated levels, signaling a major nuclear event. The lack of transparency and the initial denial from officials not only delayed necessary emergency responses, but also sowed seeds of distrust among the population and the international community. The immediate response to the Chernobyl crisis, marred by confusion and denial, highlighted the devastating consequences of prioritizing political and ideological considerations over human safety and environmental protection. This period of obfuscation and delay would later be critically examined as the world sought to learn from the disaster and prevent a recurrence of such a catastrophic failure in nuclear safety and crisis management. In the days following the catastrophic explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Soviet authorities finally initiated the evacuation of Pripyat, the city closest to the disaster site. The evacuation, though necessary, was executed with a haunting sense of urgency and secrecy, as residents were informed they would only be leaving temporarily. Families packed only the essentials, believing they would return within a few days. The streets of Pripyat quickly emptied as buses ferried the city's population away from the invisible danger that had enveloped their homes. Simultaneously, the Soviet government began the grim task of establishing what would become known as the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, an area extending 30 kilometers in radius from the nuclear plant. This zone, marked for its lethal levels of radiation, was evacuated and sealed off in an attempt to contain the contamination and prevent further exposure to the surrounding regions. The establishment of the exclusion zone represented a stark acknowledgement of the disaster's severity, transforming the vibrant communities it encompassed into ghost towns overnight. Amidst this backdrop of loss and displacement, Alexei Ivanov found himself wrestling with an overwhelming mixture of guilt and grief. He had survived the initial disaster, but the cost was high: the loss of friends, the irreversible damage to his homeland, and the heavy burden of his unheeded warnings. In the solitude of his grief, Alexei made a decisive choice. to document everything he knew about the events leading up to the explosion, the response, or lack thereof, from the plant's management and Soviet officials, and the aftermath that he was now living through. Driven by a need to ensure that the truth would not be buried alongside the radioactive debris, Alexei began meticulously recording his observations, experiences, and the evidence he and his colleagues had gathered. He detailed the systemic failures, the suppression of critical safety concerns, and the culture of secrecy that had allowed such a disaster to occur. Alexei's documentation was not just an act of catharsis, but a deliberate effort to hold those responsible accountable and to advocate for change in how nuclear energy was managed and regulated. As Alexei documented his experiences, he also grappled with the personal toll of the disaster. The act of writing became a way to process his grief, to make sense of the senseless, and to keep the memory of those lost alive. It was a solitary but resolute stand against the forces that sought to minimize the disaster's impact and consequences. The evacuation of Pripyat and the establishment of the exclusion zone marked a turning point in the Chernobyl disaster's narrative. For Alexei, the decision to document his knowledge and experiences represented a commitment to truth and a refusal to let the disaster's lessons be forgotten. His documentation would serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable tragedy, and a call to action to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. From the relative safety of a world beyond the haunting boundaries of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, Alexei Ivanov and the surviving members of his group found themselves united by a singular, unyielding purpose: to expose the harrowing truth about the Chernobyl disaster and the deep-seated conspiracy that had sought to obscure the nuclear plant's critical flaws. Their experiences within the heart of the catastrophe had left them not just as witnesses, but as custodians of a truth that had the power to catalyze change if only it could be heard. Determined to breach the iron curtain of silence and obfuscation that the Soviet authorities had drawn around the disaster, Alexei and his colleagues embarked on a perilous journey of truth-telling. They compiled reports, collected evidence, and documented testimonies that painted a damning picture of systemic negligence, ignored warnings, and the perilous culture of secrecy that characterized the Soviet nuclear industry. This cache of evidence revealed not just the technical failures that led to the explosion, but also the human cost of a system that prioritized prestige over safety. Operating from makeshift bases of operations, often in the homes of sympathetic allies or in discreet meeting places, the group leveraged every possible avenue to disseminate their findings. They reached out to international journalists, smuggled documents to embassies, and made covert contacts with environmental organizations. In an era where information was tightly controlled, their efforts to pierce the veil of state censorship were fraught with risk. Surveillance, intimidation, and the ever-present threat of arrest loomed large, yet the urgency of their mission propelled them forward. Alexei, in particular, felt a profound responsibility to act. The loss he had endured and the guilt he carried for not being able to prevent the disaster were burdens that fueled his resolve. He wrote passionately about the need for transparency in nuclear energy management and the imperative of international cooperation to safeguard against such disasters in the future. His voice, once drowned out by the machinery of the state, found new strength in the solidarity of his group and the righteousness of their cause. As word of their efforts began to spread, cracks appeared in the official narrative the Soviet government had constructed around the disaster. The international community, already alerted to the scale of the catastrophe by the detection of radioactive clouds drifting across borders, began to take notice. The work of Alexei and the survivors was not without personal cost. They lived under the constant shadow of retribution, and the psychological toll of reliving the disaster through their advocacy was immense. Yet, their actions contributed to a growing global awareness of the Chernobyl disaster's true scope and the systemic failures that had allowed it to happen. Their determination to expose the truth about the disaster and the conspiracy to hide the plant's flaws became a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring human capacity to seek justice in the face of overwhelming adversity. As Alexei Ivanov and his group intensified their efforts to expose the truth about the Chernobyl disaster, they encountered a formidable wall of resistance. The Soviet government, steadfast in its commitment to controlling the narrative, deployed its considerable resources to discredit their claims and silence their voices. State-controlled media outlets were marshaled to cast doubt on the group's credibility, and security services worked behind the scenes to disrupt their activities, employing tactics of surveillance, harassment, and intimidation. Despite these daunting obstacles, the resolve of Alexei and his colleagues remained unbroken. Their determination to bring the reality of the disaster to light gradually began to bear fruit as they found allies in unexpected places. Journalists from international media outlets, recognizing the global significance of the story, became conduits for the information Alexei's group was desperate to share. These media allies offered a platform that could amplify their voice beyond the reach of Soviet censorship, bringing the details of the Chernobyl disaster and its cover-up to a global audience. Equally important were the connections forged with the international scientific community. Scientists and nuclear experts from around the world, already alarmed by the initial reports of the disaster, were eager for accurate information. The data and first-hand accounts provided by Alexei's group filled critical gaps in understanding the disaster's scope and the systemic failures that precipitated it. These experts lent their voices to the cause, validating the group's findings and advocating for transparency and reform in nuclear safety standards on an international scale. The alliance between Alexei's group, the media, and the scientific community created a powerful coalition. Through articles, interviews, and public statements, they challenged the Soviet narrative, bringing attention to the catastrophic impact of the disaster and the need for accountability. This collaboration helped to elevate the issue on the international stage, prompting discussions within diplomatic circles and among global environmental and safety organizations. The resistance faced by Alexei and his group underscored the risks they took in their pursuit of truth, but the allies they found along the way provided them with the strength to persevere. Their partnership with the media and scientific community not only facilitated the dissemination of their findings, but also offered a measure of protection, as international scrutiny increased the cost of any attempt to silence them outright. Through these alliances, Alexei and his colleagues were able to shift the narrative around Chernobyl from one of denial and obfuscation to one of urgent inquiry and demand for change. Their journey from the isolation of their struggle within the Soviet Union to the global stage underscored the transformative power of solidarity and the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of adversity. In the years following the Chernobyl disaster, the long-term consequences of the catastrophe unfolded in stark and haunting clarity. The exclusion zone, a vast area surrounding the reactor that had been evacuated and sealed off from the outside world, stood as a silent testament to the event's catastrophic impact. This area, once teeming with life, had become a desolate wasteland, where the ghostly outlines of abandoned buildings and the remnants of deserted streets painted a chilling picture of sudden departure and loss. The exclusion zone, extending for miles around the site of the disaster, encapsulated the profound environmental and human toll of the catastrophe. Nature, in a paradoxical twist, began to reclaim the area, with wildlife returning to roam the overgrown urban landscapes, creating an eerie juxtaposition of natural resurgence amidst a backdrop of devastation. This recovery of wildlife offered a glimpse into the resilience of nature, but it also underscored the lasting legacy of human error and the indelible scars left on the environment. For the communities displaced by the disaster, the exclusion zone represented a place of lost homes, memories, and ways of life that could never be reclaimed. The forced evacuations and the subsequent abandonment of the area rendered deep psychological and cultural wounds among the affected populations, with the impact reverberating through generations. The stories of those who had lived in the shadow of the reactor before the disaster became tales of a world irrevocably altered, a stark reminder of what had been lost in the blink of an eye. The exclusion zone also served as a potent symbol of the disaster's broader implications for nuclear safety and the environment. It became a focal point for research into the long-term effects of nuclear fallout on ecosystems and human health, offering valuable insights, but also raising troubling questions about the legacy of radioactive contamination. The persistence of radiation in the zone highlighted the enduring dangers posed by such disasters, emphasizing the need for rigorous safety measures and disaster preparedness in the nuclear industry. As the years passed, the exclusion zone around Chernobyl evolved into a haunting reminder of the disaster, attracting researchers, historians, and even tourists drawn to its eerie beauty and tragic history. Its existence prompted a global reckoning with the risks of nuclear power and the importance of transparency, accountability, and international cooperation in preventing future catastrophes. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, in its desolation and resurgence, stands as a testament to the disaster's lasting impact, a physical and symbolic landscape that continues to evoke the memory of the event and its aftermath. It serves as a somber reminder of the fragility of human endeavors and the profound responsibility that comes with harnessing the atom's power. Years after the Chernobyl disaster, Alexei Ivanov found himself in a reflective state, contemplating the profound legacy of the catastrophe that had irrevocably altered the course of his life and the lives of countless others. The disaster, with its immediate horrors and long-term consequences, had become a pivotal moment in the history of nuclear energy, a grim lesson in the potential costs of hubris and negligence. Alexei thought often of the lives affected by the disaster, the workers who had responded with bravery in the face of unimaginable danger, the residents of Pripyat and the surrounding areas, who had been forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods, and the countless individuals who suffered health effects from the radiation exposure. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of tragedy that Chernobyl had woven, a personal narrative of loss and resilience in the shadow of a disaster. Reflecting on the legacy of Chernobyl, Alexei recognized the event as a catalyst for change in the nuclear industry. The disaster had exposed glaring weaknesses in safety culture, regulatory oversight, and emergency preparedness, prompting a global reassessment of nuclear power's risks and benefits. It had underscored the need for rigorous safety standards, transparent operating procedures, and a culture of accountability within the nuclear sector, principles that had been conspicuously absent in the lead-up to the catastrophe. The importance of transparency and safety in nuclear energy became a cornerstone of Alexei's reflections. He understood that the Chernobyl disaster was not merely a failure of technology, but a failure of governance, of communication, and of respect for the natural forces being harnessed. The lessons of Chernobyl, he believed, extended beyond the nuclear industry to touch on broader themes of environmental stewardship, the ethics of technological advancement, and the responsibilities of those who wield power over such potentially devastating forces. Alexei's journey from an idealistic young engineer to a witness and chronicler of one of history's worst nuclear disasters had imbued him with a deep sense of purpose. He dedicated himself to advocating for a future where the benefits of nuclear energy could be harnessed safely and responsibly, with an unwavering commitment to transparency and public engagement. He spoke at conferences, contributed to research, and engaged with policymakers, driven by the conviction that the lessons of Chernobyl must not be forgotten. In his moments of reflection, Alexei often returned to the haunting beauty of the exclusion zone, a stark reminder of the disaster's enduring impact. Yet, he also found hope in the resilience of nature, the advances in safety and technology, and the global dialogue on nuclear energy's role in addressing climate change. The legacy of Chernobyl, as Alexei saw it, was not only a tale of disaster and loss, but also a powerful impetus for change, a call to approach the atom's power with the respect and caution it demands. Years after the Chernobyl disaster had reshaped the world's understanding of nuclear power, Alexei Ivanov made a solemn pilgrimage back to the exclusion zone, a vast area forever scarred by the events of that fateful day. What was once his workplace and the surrounding vibrant community of Pripyat had transformed into a somber monument to human error, hubris, and resilience. Standing amidst the relics of the past, Alexei made a vow to himself and to the memory of those affected by the disaster. He promised to keep the story of Chernobyl alive, to share the lessons learned from this tragedy with the world, to ensure that the mistakes that led to the catastrophe would not be repeated. He understood that the disaster was not merely a Soviet tragedy, but a global warning about the risks associated with nuclear energy when human factors like arrogance, denial, and ignorance come into play. Alexei dedicated his life to advocating for nuclear safety, speaking at conferences, participating in educational initiatives, and collaborating with international organizations focused on nuclear energy. He emphasized the importance of rigorous safety protocols, transparent operations, and a culture of accountability. By sharing his experiences and the stories of Chernobyl, Alexei aimed to instill a sense of responsibility in current and future generations of engineers, policymakers, and the public. The exclusion zone, a place of loss and remembrance, also symbolized the potential for learning and growth from past mistakes. Alexei's visits to the zone served not only as a personal pilgrimage, but as a powerful reminder of the stakes involved in harnessing nuclear power. He saw in the regrowth and return of wildlife to the area a metaphor for hope and renewal, a reminder that even in the wake of great disaster, life finds a way to persevere. Alexei's vow to keep the memory of the disaster alive was a testament to his commitment to preventing future tragedies. By confronting the past with open eyes and a heart full of resolve, he believed that humanity could navigate the complexities of the modern world more wisely. The exclusion zone, with its poignant mix of desolation and resilience, would always be there as a somber reminder of what had been lost and what could still be saved.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the video. We highly recommend you watch the next video here. Oops. I'm waiting for you to click. Yes, you've clicked. Happy watching.